Hi everyone. So I do have a couple video requests that I am going to do here in the next week or so I haven't forgotten about those, but I did want to address a different topic today that has just been coming up a lot in my sessions with clients in the last couple weeks, and I wanted to relate it to some of my own experience healing as well, and just give you guys a framework to think about recovery and building resilience with. Um, there is a certain amount you can push yourself while you're healing that is beneficial. There's a certain amount that you can kind of find those edges of your capacity and use that to build resilience. And there is a point at which you overwhelm yourself and you do too much and you crash. And that actually sets your healing back, right? So it's a really fine line, and I wanted to talk a little more in detail about that today. Um, People talk about spoons with this a lot, right? Like the last thing you want to do is run out of spoons, which is this metaphorical way to talk about your energy or capacity that a lot of people with chronic illness use, right? You only have a certain number of kind of units of energy that you can use a day, and if you run out of spoons, like you're done. You don't ever want to get caught without a spoon, right? Is the idea. You always want to keep a couple spoons on hand to make sure that you don't crash or flare or whatever the issue is. People also talk about this with the bucket in terms of stress, right? The effects of stress can be beneficial until our cup overflows, right? We think about or our bucket, right? We think about the things that we can do that build stress, and we can also empty the bucket a little bit by doing things to de-stress. But if the bucket overflows, that's when we have like a major stress response that can cause a flare. People talk about this in terms of histamines as well, right? You don't want your histamine bucket to overflow because then you have a systemic reaction and you can really set your healing back. With chronic fatigue, people talk about the cliff, right? So you can get really close to the cliff, right? You can maybe do a few things in a day, but if you do one thing too much, you'll fall over that cliff, and then it's really hard to climb up, back up the cliff. So it's all these metaphors that people in the chronic illness community use because this is a universal experience, right? There's only so far you can push yourself before you really set yourself back, right? And you really have to spend some time recovering and getting kind of back to where you were. Um, but that being said, I think that fear of crashing, like the fear of going over the edge of the cliff, the fear of filling up the histamine bucket, it also sometimes gets people stuck in a state where they never really fully heal because they're so afraid to do healing things that build resilience, but that can cause a little stress on the body, right? So it is this really delicate balance, and sometimes it is difficult to navigate. In the mental health world, there's this idea of a window of tolerance, right? People use this to work with trauma and PTSD and just general nervous system dysregulation. That you can completely deprive yourself of stimuli, right? And that's actually not an optimal state. It's not actually good to experience life with no stress or no hardship or no difficulties. That actually makes us very weak and fragile, right? And then up here, there's a point where we get into overwhelm, right? Where our bodies lose the capacity to process and integrate information or cannot handle the kind of stimuli we're being given. And that's when we get into a state of overwhelm. And that's not a good state for the body to be in either, right? That's a really damaging state for the body to be in, especially long term. But there is this window in between, right? And that's called the window of tolerance, right? Where we experience a little bit of stress, we experience some hardship here and there, we have opportunities to build resilience and overcome things, but never in a way that overwhelms our system. So I love this metaphor, and I've used it a lot with my mental health clients and with my trauma clients in order for them to figure out where their edge of tolerance is, right? Because the idea is if you can find opportunities to experience that upper edge of that window of tolerance, you can actually widen it, right? You can make it bigger, so you're actually going to be able to tolerate more stress and more difficulty without your nervous system becoming overwhelmed. And when you're severely mentally ill or you've had really severe trauma, your window of tolerance is very small, right? And it's kind of more towards the edge of that lower end of stimuli in terms of what you can handle. These are people who have a lot of triggers, who feel very activated a lot of times. Their window of tolerance is very, very little. And so they have to constantly kind of push into that edge of that upper edge of that window of tolerance in order to build their resilience and build their capacity and basically teach their nervous system that they can handle more than they think they can. Um, but if you overstimulate yourself too much and you push into a trigger too hard, you can flip up into overwhelm, and then it does set you back a little bit. So I think this metaphor is really relevant when it comes to chronic illness, in terms of physical illnesses as well, because we all know, like mind body, right, is the same thing. They completely overlap, and so when we're talking about the nervous system, we aren't just talking about mental health, we're also talking about the body's physiological capacity as well. And so this is true with people with chronic illnesses, autoimmune diseases, nervous system disorders, things like that, neurological issues, is that your body's capacity, your window of tolerance has gotten really, really small, right? You've been so chronically overwhelmed with stressors, a lot of them physiological stressors, toxins, nutrient deficiencies, microbiome imbalance, all of that stuff I talk about all the time. Your body has gotten so chronically overwhelmed that your body's capacity to deal with stress has gotten very low because it's been chronically dealing with so much stress for so long that it can't handle any added stressors. And so people often have to live in this very small, confined, quiet world in order to cope because such small things will set off their symptoms, right? So this is people who are kind of living on the edge of that cliff, to use that as a metaphor, or kind of always have the bucket like almost overflowing, right? Very full. Um, and so a big part of healing is, first of all, getting stabilized, right? Supporting your body in the ways that are going to kind of pull you back from the edge of the cliff a little bit and are going to empty your bucket a little bit, right? So that you have a little more to work with, right? Stabilization is very important, and that's why the nutrition, the supplementation, the lifestyle practices, all these things are so important. But at the same time, as you start to stabilize, it's important to then start increasing that window of tolerance. Now, for some people, this may take years before they get to a place where they're stable enough to do this. And that's fine. There's no, like, optimal timeline, right? I was just talking about that recently, where everyone is different with their healing timeline, and it's really important to not have expectations about when certain things are going to happen, but you will know. And it's important to trust that there is going to be a time when you're going to have enough stability, right? You're going to have enough extra spoons consistently. You're going to be just enough away from the edge of the cliff consistently that you can actually start to push into the edge of the cliff and make the edge of the cliff farther away from you, right? Kind of push that out. You can make your bucket taller, right? You can expand that window of tolerance by gently pushing into things that scare you and stress you out. People with chronic illness have a lot of trauma relating to not trusting their body, to not feeling like their body has a capacity to do normal things or withstand normal stressors or stimuli, right? And so it's so important to start to regain that sense of empowerment. And I'll give some examples from my own journey. When I declared myself in remission, I actually still was having symptoms. It's not like I was symptom free. I'm actually much, much, much more symptom free now than I was, 3 years ago when I decided that I was in remission. But what happened was I got to this point where my chronic fatigue had so greatly reduced and my dysautonomia symptoms had so greatly reduced that I realized I actually had a lot of extra spoons on hand. Like, I actually had a lot more capacity than I had had in a really long time. I realized I was stable enough that I could start to push my body. And so I started out just by going on hikes. And what I would do was each week I would add like a quarter mile onto my hike and just see how I did. And the first time, I hadn't been walking more than a couple blocks, and the first time I went for a 3-mile hike, I had a big histamine flare. The stress of the experience of like my nervous system doing something, it made my cheeks flush. But nothing else happened. Like my cheeks turned all red, like my eyes felt glassy, like I felt really hot, my heart rate went up a little bit. So I should say it wasn't like a massive histamine flare, but it was, a noticeable one. And I just kind of let myself settle from it. I didn't read too much into it. I just kind of noticed, like, okay, that was definitely like at the end, that was right at the edge of my capacity, right? What my nervous system could handle. But the next week I did a hike of the same distance, and that time I was totally fine. Right? So that's an example of how you can push into that edge of tolerance. And I actually do this a lot with my histamine clients because when you have a histamine disorder, your nervous system is afraid of everything. It's afraid of everything, even completely inert substances, right? And so you kind of have to push through that little edge in order to build your tolerance to more things. The first time I went backpacking at high altitude after I, went into remission, I had a flare-up of dysautonomia symptoms. My heart started racing. I felt dizzy and lightheaded, more than was warranted for the altitude I was at. I mean, I know some of that is normal for high altitude, but I wasn't at that high altitude, just higher altitude than I'd been since I had gotten sick. And again, I just kind of like noticed it, sat with it, was like, okay, I'm at the edge of my capacity. I got down from that altitude as quickly as I could. But the next time I went up to that altitude, a few months later, I didn't have that reaction, right? My body had learned that I could actually stress myself out a little more than it thought I could, and I would be okay. Same with the first time I went and lifted weights with a friend when I decided I was healthy enough to start building muscle. I actually had a hive, a couple hives form on my cheek when I started lifting weights, even though it was very light. My body was like, hey, what's going on? What are you doing? You're stressing yourself out. You can't handle this. And I said to my body, no, like, it's okay. I can do this. It's not a big deal. And I did, like, pause for the day. I didn't push further into that. But I went back, like, 3 days later and did another little weight workout, and I didn't get hives that time. And it's just continued to be like that, right? I've continued to just kind of push into that edge of tolerance, so that my window has just expanded and expanded and expanded, where I just really don't react to things at all anymore, unless I'm going through an intentional acute detox for something. Then sometimes I'll have a little resurgence of symptoms, but on a day-to-day basis, I don't react to things anymore at all. And it's because I was able to approach that edge of what I felt like my body's capacity was and just kind of approach it and gently push into it and then back off. And when I came back the next time, my window was taller. So this is a really, really helpful metaphor. I love the idea of the cliff and the spoons and the bucket. We don't talk about how we lengthen that cliff or raise the height of that bucket, or fill the drawer with more spoons. I mean, we don't extend the metaphor in that way all the time, and so I like the concept of the window of tolerance because it shows how you can push into that. So basically the way you have to do that is, again, first of all, you have to stabilize enough, right? You have to get enough systemic stress off your body that your body does have more capacity. When you're in like the initial stages of healing, you don't want to push yourself at all, right? Except to like do your basic detoxification and microbiome resetting and all of that kind of stuff. But as you start stabilizing a bit, how you kind of complete that healing is to start lengthening that window of tolerance and expanding your capacity through very slow, intentional steps. So like I said, I increased my hikes from a quarter mile each time I did it, and I would, do just like 1 rep more of weights, anytime I went weightlifting. Very slow, very intentional. Even if you feel like you could do way more, don't. There's no reason to, and you have the potential to just overwhelm your nervous system instead of intentionally increase that capacity by just a little bit. So it's kind of like being the loving but firm parent, right? Like the loving but firm parent doesn't tell their kid they can't go swimming because they can't handle it, but they also don't throw their kid into the deep end and hope they figure it out, right? The loving parent actually takes their kid and like tells them, you can do it. I know it's scary, but you can get in there and you can swim, and kind of like reassures them. And when the kid starts to get overwhelmed, they know that they've had enough. And then the next time the kid isn't so afraid of the water, right? So it's that same idea. So I hope this was helpful in terms of how you kind of get through those, or how you kind of increase your capacity to tolerate more stress as your symptoms start to stabilize and your health starts to improve. How you kind of get that last little bit of healing. To get you really into a solid remission where you're not scared of the world anymore and you don't have to fear it. I am going to do a video sometime next week on the very early stages of my healing. I had a question on like how I transitioned into a healing diet through all my histamine symptoms and all that kind of stuff. And I've talked a little bit about this before in some of my videos about my healing story, but I'm going to go into a lot more detail of some of the beginning stages and how I transitioned into it. So I hope that was helpful. If people have other questions or other topics they want me to address, I will add it to the list. So just leave a comment and let me know.